Today, I am joined by my friend Jeremy Carl. Jeremy Carl is a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. He was also at the Hoover Institution formerly, and he was also in the Trump administration as the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Interior. Welcome, Jeremy.
Pleasure to be on, Alex.
Yeah, I'm happy we're finally doing this because we've chatted before. I really enjoyed your writing. And you are specialized in a few areas. And one of these areas is immigration, which is also the topic of one of your most recent pieces. And I think that's a good jumping off point because I'm to be honest, I'm probably a little bit conflicted on the topic of immigration just by the result of having been one and having benefited so much from
Sure.
immigration. My husband is himself an emigre, and it's a complicated um, relationship to the whole concept.
Sure.
Um, and we often hear that America is a nation of immigrants, and that is such a it seems to be almost the slogan for the entire project. You have a problem with this perspective. It's not. It doesn't tell the whole story. So what's wrong with it?
Yeah, well, the piece that you reference is kind of adapted from a talk I gave at a Claremont event in DC called the Rise of the Ruling Class. And the title of it was sort of A Nation of Settlers. And it really is to say, it kind of walks through the whole history of how we became in the public mind a nation of immigrants. And I kind of show in the piece that really this was not an organic thing, but part of a conscious Democratic Party electoral strategy that sort of started in the mid 20th century, which is, of course, not to say, which would be absurd, that we didn't have immigration beforehand, that we didn't. Have times in which immigration was a more important part of what we did, but it is to kind of cast it in terms of a truer history of the country that goes back to where we really were a kind of settler society for quite a long time, for really almost the first 200 years, really, I would argue almost exclusively. And then we kind of move up until 1890 when the frontier closes, and then we become and that's sort of according to the Census Bureau, they literally put out things saying the frontier is closed. We kind of settled all the parts of um, the United States. And then we kind of move into this mixed economy, if you will, of where we have some immigration and some settlement, but then we kind of go through a very intense period of immigration from about the late 1880s to 1920, and at that point in the early 1920s, people kind of get freaked out because they say, "Hey, we're becoming a nation of immigrants. We're not really sure that we really want to be a nation of immigrants in that way," and we kind of shut the door pretty dramatically for 40 years. And then it was really only over um, a period of ethnic activism that was really encapsulated by this birth of this phrase, "a nation of immigrants," that we kind of moved into the more modern sort of notion of us being a nation of immigrants, starting in the mid 1960s with the Hart-Celler Act. And that, of course, transformed America quite dramatically demographically, even though, of course, the sponsors at the time claimed that it would not do that. I just really trying to give a fuller uh, picture of what the America's immigration history looks like outside of sort of some of the propaganda around it.
Yeah, and you make this clear distinction between a settler and an immigrant. But what characterizes the settler in opposition to the
Well,
immigrant?
a settler is creating a new society. And so when the Pilgrims came in 1620, um, they, of course, interacted with the Native Americans who'd been here for thousands of years themselves and had their own societies, but they weren't looking to become Native Americans or join a Native American society. They were looking to build their own. And they did so. And of course, there were a lot of conflict and atrocities on both sides. My wife's family, had various members scalped in the late 1600s, in settler native conflicts. So, I mean, I think this was really part of the story. Of course, it wasn't the exclusive story. There was cooperation. There was even at times intermarriage. At some significant ways and significant times. But we really were building, for better or for worse, our and I would certainly argue for better overall, our own society, and that this really encapsulated American society for most of its first 200 years and even longer. I live out in Montana, which is still kind of, to the extent that the lower 48 has a frontier in America, we're sort of it. And certainly you can talk to folks whose families have lived here for a while, and you'll hear stories even into the late 19th century, early 20th century from people's families about kind of living on the frontier as sort of settlers in a very sort of, I don't want to, primitive is not the quite word, but it was a very marginal existence and not really kind of um, joining anything, but really creating a new thing with all the challenges that that implies.
Yeah, and there's kind of it is an interesting mix of people. The initial settlers of America. It's quite a unique thing. I don't know if you've read the book Albion Seed.
I have.
Um, yeah, and it's, to someone coming outside of the Anglosphere, and I guess probably to a lot of people in the Anglosphere, it's quite a surprising description of the customs, the folkways, the nature and the level of strictness with which things were just handled back then. It, 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 America would look very differently if I don't know a you know a flotilla of Romanians would have come and
Yeah,
just in a different way. I don't think
I,
we would have
I,
in the
I'm
first.
I'm
That's
picturing
number
the
one.
pilgrims wearing tracksuits, and it's Adidas
Exactly.
tracksuits, and it's
You
working
have
for
to
me
build the
in a weird way.
BMW before you squat next to it. Yeah, there's a whole problem. And I feel like, there are certain types of populations who tend to be the settlers, and there are certain type of populations tend to be the followers. Read into my description of this whatever you'd like. But it's a different act to settle versus to immigrate, like you've laid that out.
Yeah.
And I feel like what we've seen in the US and we've seen in Europe as well, is that a lot of the populations who come later have different folkways. They have different ways of adapting or not. And I think that's what happened after Hard Seller.
Yeah, and I'd say further. And by the way, that's a Albion Seed is a terrific book, and would recommend to anyone. Uh, but I think you're right to draw this distinction, and I think people and maybe certainly if you're from Europe and you're not maybe as well read as you are, this is kind of something hard to appreciate. But of course, the early settlers here, the mortality was just enormous. The risk was enormous, and they were religious fanatics. I mean, that's why they went there. And I say that I'm Christian myself and a conservative Christian, but I mean, these guys took it to a different level. I mean, the Jamestown mortality, which was kind of one of the first, really the first serious settlement, was approaching 90%. The first winter for the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, we lost 50%. These were just enormously risky ventures, and the sorts of people who took them on were very different than those who followed after, even their co-ethnics in many ways. I mean, it was just a very different set of incentives, a very different type of people. And I think the other thing that folks from Europe often kind of maybe, which where the culture is sort of so much of a from time immemorial type thing, have difficulty in understanding about the U.S. is just how young we are. I mean, my mother grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, at a time when Phoenix, which now has about 1.7 million people, had 50,000 people. And what had Arizona had just been a state for 27 years when she was born. I mean, it was unsettled. It was a settled territory until then. It wasn't even part of the United States in a full way. That's how young this country is, and how recent our development is. And I think that really colors a lot of the American character in many ways.
Yeah, I think one of the more kind of compelling arguments that I hear for the maybe more libertarian proponents of immigration in the US is the idea that, okay, fertility is declining globally, and this is something I've covered on this podcast as well, and that's, pretty much lying eyes fact for anyone who, is out there and looking at,
Yeah,
what families look like today. And the fact that the US still maintains its status as receiver of some of the most intelligent people in the world. People
yeah,
still really want to go to these legacy Ivy League institutions, and even like someone in Russia has a smart kid. Harvard is the name that pops into your head. Like all of this, there's a lot of attraction to it. So this kind of positive, these people do contribute scientifically. They contribute in
Sure.
many ways, and I feel like, yeah, I mean, it's hard to give that up. Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, I am not a zero immigration, close the door completely guy myself. I think we do want to recruit. It's just like any successful business, successful whatever. You want to recruit the top people from wherever you get them, but that's a thin slice. And if we're realistic, um, it's not the vast majority of immigration we're getting today. Just, I mean, numerically, it's just a fact. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look what's going down in our uh, southern border right now, it is not Nobel laureates knocking at the door. Not that some of them might not be really able or hardworking, or maybe even one of them will be a future Nobel laureate. But the vast majority, particularly of our illegal immigration, is low skill, and kind of replacing and driving down wages for U.S. labor. Additionally, even some of the high skill labor um, becomes a problem. You certainly look at things like the H-1B visas, which are kind of you're familiar because you have a tech background. Um, but they're not sending their best under the H-1B visa typically. And there's a lot. I mean, this is an area where I've done a fair bit of research, and there's a lot of kind of scams going on where essentially you're getting third tier programmers from India coming in to undercut a U.S. programmer's wage, but they're not really the best. And again, I would never argue that we shouldn't go get a really top programmer or a top scientist or a top figure from the arts from wherever we get them. I mean, I think that type of recruiting is really necessary for keeping the society dynamic and making it successful. But that would not really be an accurate kind of description of the mass of immigration we've had. And I think people will go back on the other end of this, sort of the more libertarian types, and they'll say, well, look at the early 20th century immigration. That's not really what they were. And I think that's absolutely accurate. But the difference is we were an industrializing society at the time, and a manufacturing based society, and one with massive needs for low skilled labor. Given where we were, we also weren't a welfare society at the time. We didn't have a welfare state, and that's why, of course, a lot of folks ended up not making it and going back. Um, we're at a very different stage of our development right now as a
Yeah.
country, um, and we need different immigrants and it should be there to serve the national interest unapologetically. That's why we should have immigration. We shouldn't do it as an altruistic thing for somebody else. It's to serve the interests of the American people.
Yeah, and it really does make a difference if when you move from like you said, industrializing state to a welfare state. Also, the source of the immigration. I mean, this is like Central and South America is just there's just a different caliber of immigration. Like you said, often they're not sending their best, and you can see that in many ways. From even like synthetic like fentanyl sources like
Yeah,
from across the borders, war in Juarez. Like there's so
yeah,
much stuff going on there that you'd
yeah.
maybe want to close your borders for. That yeah, it's just it's nuts. And the idea that the US shouldn't have any guardrails against essentially, banana republic chaos is a bit yeah,
Yeah.
a bit
Well, and in
crazy.
addition, of course, we have an entire racial preference regime right now, which makes it even crazier in many cases because in many times, we're as citizens, to the extent I'm representative of anything, I'm supposed to welcome in somebody who immediately, as soon as they touch down at the border, is going to have all sorts of legal preferences over me. Their kids will have legal preferences over my kids in the sort of racial spoils regime that we have kind of developed. And of course, this is a very subversive topic within the U.S. And it's just kind of nuts to me, that we've allowed this to go on in any way.
Yeah.
I mean, we've sort of gone from a no Irish need apply early 20th century thing. And I'm not, by the way, of course, suggesting to the extent that was at all pervasive, that was a good thing, but it just to point out that, historically, as is quite common, immigrants suffered from a fair bit of discrimination in the US. we've now kind of moved to an almost immigrant preference system in many cases. Um, and it's just, again, I mean, it's just, to me, it's culturally and nationally suicidal. So, I mean, I don't really know what more to say
Yeah.
than that.
No, I think there's also kind of the question of just raw numbers and raw fertility, and the U.S. is still compared to a lot of places still has quite high average fertility, but I can see in Western Europe, I mean, it's almost incontrovertibly true that every mainstream politician is thinking that they're going to solve their fertility crisis by just flooding more and
Yeah,
more people because people obviously are interchangeable cogs that you just plug into your neoliberal global machine. They're just going to be producing whatever
right.
widgets for you. Hasn't worked out that well up until now, but they're still trying. They're really trying
Yeah.
even harder.
Well, it's
Yeah.
it's it's an erasure of culture. It's a lack of seriousness about cultural difference. It's a lack of respect for your own nationality and for other nationalities. I mean, it's really part and parcel of the sort of what the subversive writer Steve Saylor is called invade the world, invite the world. I mean, I think those two are really two sides of the same coin. And kind of feeling that there's this universal Westernism that everybody wants to embrace and that they're going to be happy to embrace when they come here, and we'll all be one big happy family under capitalism. And it's a lack of respect for anybody's culture that, to me,
Yeah.
really undergirds that type of false notion. It's a lack of respect for our culture, and it's a lack of respect for immigrants' cultures. And I've traveled extensively. For years I've lived in the developing world. I mean, I have a lot of respect for a variety of cultures that are very, very different from our own, and I don't necessarily expect that those people just will naturally want to give up their culture. But then that, of course, if you have millions of them immigrate here, that creates problems, because you just get this multicultural cultural clash, and I just think it never ends well. I mean, I start from a basis that diversity is a weakness, not a strength, and unity in a country is a strength. And you can obviously overdo unity, and you can, diminish diversity to so much extent that you never welcome anybody. And I think those are both mistakes. But you want to lean on the side pretty strongly of things that unify you as a culture, and we haven't done that. And I think when you look at so much of the friction we have right now in US society, it can really it kind of really comes down to that, to me, as at a base level. It's like, what do we have in common? I used When I was a kid, I could answer that. Today I can't answer that in any meaningful way.
Yeah, because there was kind of a core culture that derived from that, initial Anglo stock in some ways with,
Yeah,
whatever admixture there was. It was clear what was the main culture. And it was also, a different type of technology as well. I mean, now you actually can have a multiplicity of cultures that you can inhabit one day or the other. Like technology really kind of gives you that illusion that
sure.
you're yeah, in different communities, and in a way you are in different
Yeah.
forms
Well,
or
and
whatever.
and I think travel is another piece, right? It's so easy to go back and forth today, where it wasn't generations ago. I mean, it was either a really perilous voyage, which was at the beginning, or even when a lot of my ancestors came here in the mid 19th century. I mean, it was uh, you know weeks of nobody was flying a plane to London the next day. So it's a very different type of thing. We've also gotten very casual about people having citizenship in 7 countries, even though that's, of course, technically supposed to be illegal here in the U.S. We don't treat ourselves as a serious country, and so it's hardly a surprise that many of the people immigrating here don't really take us as anything other than a piggy bank, uh, either.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think that's
isn't
unfortunately where
that
we
kind
are.
of the yeah, that's kind of the core of, the the universalist creed that all of these, politicians subscribe to, like the fact that there really shouldn't be countries, and the fact that,
Yeah.
we're still attached in, weird ways, like archaic ways to this idea of a country or the borders and stuff is, we're still kind of using these concepts, but the future obviously will be a place where
Yeah.
there's just going to be management will manage all the processes that we need. We'll need the food stuffs and the water stuffs, and the gender surgery stuffs, you get them at the different points of distribution. It's yeah, I mean, it really does feel like that. I don't know if you've seen this little video of, I think it's the foreign affairs minister in Germany, and she was saying that she really doesn't care what her German voters think of her, but she will, continue to support the Ukraine and stand for Ukraine as long as they can. And obviously, she's talking about the fact that energy has, I think, gone up 11-fold or 12-fold as of the
Yeah.
last time I've checked. That was a few days ago. Might have gone up even harder. This is really tough. Like, German industry is shutting down. Hundreds of companies have stopped production because you just can't do it. Um, the fact that she has no allegiance whatsoever to her voters, the people who allegedly put her in power, keep her there, tell you, number one, about how democracy works. She is not accountable to these people,
Yeah.
not at all. And two, what her allegiances are and what most of these guys' allegiances are. I mean,
Yeah.
she even spoke it in English in the main language of the empire, so we can all
Yeah.
understand.
No, no, no. Of course, and I think you're exactly right, and it's amazing to me. And in many ways, I'm a class traitor because I would be lying to say that I am not myself a member of the globalist overclass by educational training, by socialization. I'm out here right now at the fringes of empire as part of my sort of protest against that, but certainly by background and professionally, I am that, but it was always one of the things that really just repelled me about these folks was their lack of national feeling, or to even suggest, as I think you correctly note, that a lot of them feel that um, there's something somehow indecent about that type of feeling or wrong. And to me, it's that's the true beauty of diversity, is that we have these diversity of nationalities and customs and cultures. And I literally, I mean, I've been really fortunate. I spent 3 years of my life basically just kind of traveling around the world with a backpack, basically, in mostly in the developing world, and experiencing the kind of rich diversity and of ways in which people live. And I think that's beautiful. And to the extent that people want to homogenize that under kind of the umbrella of American Western capitalism, I just think it's a tragedy. It's not that, of course, we can't have cultures always borrow. Things are going to seep in. You can probably get decent pizza in China these days. That wasn't true when I traveled extensively in China 20 plus years ago, I can tell you. But and that's okay. But to the extent that China becomes the U.S., I think it's a loss for China and the U.S. And I think Chinese leadership, maybe even to a fault, probably also believes that, but they're sort of more aware of their own cultural traditions and the risk of losing them. So um, uh, yeah, it's just sad to watch the lack of loyalty uh, to of a nation like Germany, which has its own rich traditions, culture, and history to that. And as you point out, even speaking in the language of empire, English, is just kind of indicative of where these folks' loyalties lie.
Yeah, I think Germany is really ground zero for this type of thinking, like Klaus Schwab and all this type of stuff. There's
Yeah,
kind of a almost, you kind of have to renounce the concept of nationhood from that place. It's almost a sacred place for the universalists. It's like, okay, this is where the most intolerance has happened, the singularity of intolerance, and now this must be the ground from which universal tolerance. This is the new society is built from here, and there are a lot of people with their glassy eyes coming out of Germany being
yeah.
the zealots for the new way of living.
Right. Well, there's a certain, I've heard this called Hitler's revenge at times, in that, what happened under Nazism was obviously so horrific, that, and I mean, we had some very good friends who were German when, before they left the US a few years ago to go back. and they were sort of from this upper class German milieu. I mean, they were actually von, whatever. They were literally from the younger class, um, and you could tell they were personally scarred by kind of Germany's participation in the Holocaust and everything that happened in World War II. Even though, of course, they personally, I mean, they were born long after, they had nothing to do with it, but they would tell me that, and they sympathized with this view that basically sort of any type of national feeling in Germany was almost sort of verboten. That it would have just been seen as scandalous. Sort of what we would consider in the U.S. normal national pride was sort of stigmatized, and I think Germany is kind of the extreme case of that. Now, again, I think it's understandable. I understand it from a human perspective, but there's also a certain element that's tragic about that. I mean, there's a lot of middle space between like sending everybody who might be a little bit foreign to the gas chambers and not deciding to have a nation at all, or not having any pride in your country. Um, but I think in a lot of Europe, it's just become very difficult to occupy that space.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just think about individual immigrants that they know, and it has a very personal dimension, especially now that immigration has ballooned to a crazy level where it's extremely hard to actually implement legislation that would inevitably have to be harsh for some people.
Yeah,
And yeah, that's I think I see that being an issue even just with people in my life, which some of them are conservative, not as conservative as me because it's a bit hard, but they really would have issues with that.
yeah, you're right. It's difficult. I mean, I don't have a problem being, that kind of strict, mean guy, but I think it's difficult in our feminized political culture of caring and compassion to straight hard boundaries. And I should add, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to why the vast majority of folks like this are immigrating here. Like, especially, I've been in some of the countries these folks are immigrating from in many cases. And if I were in their situation, I'd probably be doing exactly what they're doing. Um, uh,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that it's in our interests. And that's ultimately what has to govern for us, I think, American policy. So, I'm never angry. And in fact, I say this in my piece, A Nation of Settlers. Um, I'm not angry at the immigrants at all. And in fact, many of them will go on to become super valuable and productive American citizens. Um, I'm angry at the global left and the Klaus Schwab world that has told me that, I have to accept this, hyper capitalist, non, non-culture, this sort of global, you know, mess of pottage. That's kind of my birthright right now. And I reject that. I want to have a proud and distinctive culture here in the United States. I certainly want my own children not to be discriminated against, and I've got 5 kids, as you know, so this is not just an academic
Hmm.
exercise for me.
Yeah,
Um,
you've done your part.
I've done my part, so we're above replacement here. But yeah, I mean, I think when you have a lot of kids, or even if you've got a kid, these debates become much less academic and much less. So I'm kind of fine where I am, and I know I can make things work, and much more sort of personal, like how is this going to work? How is America going to work for my kids? And I think the answer is not very well, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about like feminization. I think that's a good way to put it as well. Is I feel like just the adults have left the room, and they have left many rooms, and they have left essential rooms that should have been populated by adults. Like I've been talking about like the energy crisis and a lot of things in that direction, and the health of the grid and what we're seeing here. I'm personally like this is something I worry about every like I wake up at night and I'm very concerned about energy security because like I've got like my heating's on energy. It gets to -20 in this house. I have no options. I have a baby. Like if the grid collapses, even for a few days, we're at serious trouble. We need to like start burning furniture level. It's, yeah. So
Gonna be back
uh,
in World War II, right? It's
exactly. I mean, little things like this, little thing, little kind of daisy change little things that are kept alive by like some 70-year-old dude in the back of a, factory somewhere and, very sensitive infrastructure. No one's minding that. That's not where the attention is. The attention is on, insane things.
well, it's funny you mentioned it, that or very skilled interviewing that you mentioned it because of course we haven't talked about it, but my real professional background and a lot of my training is really in energy policy. It's where I did my graduate work. I've written lots of boring books on energy policy that I would not recommend to anybody except for energy policy nerds. But I was interested in it and continue to be interested in it because it's such a core issue for people in just the way you describe. I mean, it's like, how am I going to heat my home when I turn on the light? Is the light going to go on? I wrote a book called Keeping the Lights On at America's Nuclear Power Plants that was addressing just this, because what you do end up having is the 70-year-old guy who's been running it for 40 years. And now, everybody's saying, well, we don't need you. I mean, you saw this really dramatically in Germany. Um, and I've just been stunned to the degree to which, even after what some of us warned would happen, and of course, famously Donald Trump warned would happen with Russian natural gas blackmail, um, that they're not just, turning on every coal fired power plant, uh, you know, getting nuclear to go back on is a little trickier, but just sort of full steam ahead, that climate would even be a serious part of this discussion, just shows the kind of lack of seriousness of the debate. And again, I say this as I'm kind of a mushy moderate on the climate issue, so it's not that I'm saying that from a full skeptic's perspective, but it's a lack of seriousness about the core basic interests that people have to be, to have the lights be on, to be able to cook, to be warm. And it's really sort of shocking to watch that abdication in real time of interest by Europe's leaders of its own citizens in favor of really aggressively adjudicating the eastern border of Ukraine. So, yeah, I mean, the mystery.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like the case of nuclear power is a very interesting case study that is, I feel, extremely narrative led. And by that I mean just, 3 Mile Island. There was actually recently a documentary about 3 Mile Island. And to be honest, I was just watching it and just waiting. And my question throughout was, who died?
Yeah,
What
nobody.
exactly is the problem here? Like, I
Yeah,
mean, obviously there's sludge and the people they're crying, then, people are recounting, seeing stuff on TV and crying and crying. And I'm just thinking, okay, please, someone tell me what exactly went wrong here. I mean,
yeah,
I'm not trying to completely downplay, but really, I mean, I could make a documentary about something that happened here 2 weeks, like a very bad car accident that had more fatalities and more fallout than that. So it's, and even the Chernobyl documentary, which is, nicely produced and quite good, but, to orient your whole perspective on almost something that is pretty much a miracle and that
yeah,
would solve most of the problems that
yeah.
churning political movements are trying to solve all over Europe, just because it's, I don't know, libertarian coded or conservative coded because of, you saw 5 movies, I don't know. It's nuts, and it tells you a lot about the power of media and the power of kind of just telling these stories.
It does, and people conflate it with, of course, the nuclear bomb, which was obviously horrific, but
Exactly.
just a totally different sort of technology. And it's not to say, of course, that nuclear has no risks. I mean, we saw in Chernobyl what could happen in the sort of almost worst case catastrophe of incompetence plus bad reactor design plus a non free society. But of course, every form of power that we could have has costs and benefits. And certainly to the extent that, um, that folks are sort of climate catastrophists, to not have baseload zero carbon nuclear as part of the solution. I mean, that's just it's my litmus test to folks I talk to who claim to be clear about, really concerned about climate, to whether they're at all serious. Um, if they're sort of pro nuclear, then you can sometimes have a serious conversation with them about like what an energy grid might look like. If they are really dismissive or negative about nuclear, as is often the case in the U.S. and elsewhere, then they're just they're just posturing. Interestingly, there are sort of limits perhaps to this, and that even in crazy California recently, they were basically they'd been planning to shut down their last nuclear power plant, and it was really clear that to anybody with a brain that this was going to exacerbate the already very serious power problems within the state. All the environmental groups screamed and hollered. California is a far left state, and the state legislature just basically told the enviros to go take a hike. I mean, because they're crazy, but they're not that crazy. And so
Yeah.
there are ultimately limits to which reality bumps against, at least in the US. We'll see in Europe, right? Like what this winter is going to look like. Um, we've been talking about visiting these friends of ours in Germany who I mentioned. I'm kind of like, I don't know that I want to go to Germany over Christmas this year. It may not be the best time with no heat in Munich. So
Yeah,
we'll
snuggle
see.
up warm.
Yeah,
They should give each other lots of hugs when you're there.
yeah, yeah,
Oh man. Yeah, that's, the whole idea of who is going to actually, be careful because like you said, they're not that crazy. And I think there are still a few people there who are actually, like even in the Soviet Union, my dad essentially was part of kind of this cast of shadow, technical people who were keeping the lights on and, despite central planning and despite even the central planners knew that for anything to be made, there has to be, 5, 10, 100, 1,000, dudes who are technically adept and actually are making these things or, can fix them if they, yeah, something gets busted. And he
yeah,
was hydroelectric engineer, and he used to do these hydro plants across the Soviet Union, and even idiot communists knew that this was essential. Do we know that?
yeah.
Is there like a system, even like a shadow system, where people in power know that okay, we need about 1,000 smart dudes to make this thing work, and no affirmative anything will make this stuff work. It doesn't matter what the HR lady thinks.
Yeah, no, and this is where I think the tech overlord dematerialization of everything, the ideology behind that. And again, I grew up professionally in that world. I was sort of part of Internet 1.0 from the earliest days, but that kind of ideology just sort of runs up against the hard realities that you're talking about, or you see in places like South Africa right now, where to kind of overcome the obvious racial discrimination that happened under apartheid, they sort of moved to the opposite, and as a result, they don't have competent engineers to run their power plants, and the lights aren't on anymore in South Africa, right? Which is a problem for white and black South Africans.
I
And
mean, isn't sorry to interrupt you there, but isn't something similar happening in Jackson, Mississippi right now?
Yeah, oh,
I mean,
absolutely, right? And I sort of had to laugh at all of these, like, there was in particular this one woke reporter from uh, Brooklyn who was railing against Republican-run Mississippi, and I'm from the Southeast, that's where I grew up, and I know from, I mean, I've been in Jackson, I've followed it. I mean, it's been run by this crazy, sort of literally black nationalist regime for a while that has just kind of been running the city into the ground. And so it's a little bit, it's interesting. We saw a similar thing in Flint, Michigan, with the water that was, blamed on the Republican governor, who, admittedly, like the Republican governor didn't handle that situation perfectly, but somehow the Democrats who ran that city for 70 years or more and ran the water system into the ground escaped media blame entirely. Imagine my shock. And the people who didn't totally provide adult supervision to these idiots somehow got all the blame. I think it's sort
yeah.
of, again, broader, more broadly indicative of some of the unhealthy trends we have in the United States.
I think another blue check was blaming white flight for the
Yeah,
problems in Jackson,
yeah.
and one of the anons was saying that access to white people is not a human right.
Right. Well,
So,
but people think it is, and then unfortunately, there are people who talk about it. Well, you're running out of white people to kind of blame for stuff like this. And again, I mean, you want to talk about subversive. I mean, the the dialogue on race is so dishonest in this country, and is really, kind of it is the third rail, and I know because I touch it sort of shamelessly under my own name with a fair bit of frequency. Um, but it's just I mean, it's really so poisonous. It's poisonous to getting anything done. Um, in particular, we kind of have both sacralized and infantilized Black people in America, which is not good for Black people. It's not good for anybody else. As opposed to saying, hey, like everybody else, you're responsible for your own shortcomings and you get credit for the things you do well. Um, this is the even among sort of subversive or based Republicans or even anons. I mean, the inability to talk seriously about race in any meaningful way is a real. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the
I mean,
Achilles heel.
that's why there are anons, and that's essentially what
Right.
that's the thing they cover, and that's why that space is attracting, a lot of
Yeah.
attention because they say the things that people cannot say, or they
Yeah.
say them in very creative ways.
Well, and I get it. Like I get, that you get canceled, and I've been semi-canceled myself, so I'm appreciative of that, and I don't diminish. But rather than trying to push back or like pretend that we could actually govern the country and just say, hey, no, we're not gonna play this type of racial blackmail. People just fold as a default position, and of course, it doesn't help that the Republican Party folds as a default position,
Default.
but it doesn't need to be like this way. And by the way, it won't be this way because reality will get a vote. The question is, how much unpleasantness are we going to have to go through before we get to a more sane system and way of dealing with this? I mean, are we going to be able to muddle our way through? My that's my hope, certainly, to a more sane way of talking about these sorts of issues, or are we going to kind of blow up in a Hobbesian war of all against all? I worry. I worry the latter.
Yeah.
Looks increasingly likely as
The
time goes on.
the only two, I think, relevant examples in recent history are South Africa and Brazil.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I don't think there's much else to
yeah.
to draw from.
Well, and I think the Brazilification of America is probably what we'll probably end up with. I mean, I don't think we're not going to wind up in a sort of truly alarming way. But I've spent a fair bit of time in Brazil, and you have, um, I mean, you
Some
have
nice
a sort of.
places.
Yeah,
There's
there's
some
some
nice
nice
parts of
places in
town.
Brazil, and if you've got money in Brazil, like you can live pretty well with a lot of security, right? But
Yeah.
it's not exactly a place of great opportunity for all, and it's not a place where the public sector works really well, and it's not a place where politics works really well, and it's certainly we can aim higher than being Brazil.
Yeah.
But I worry that the Brazilification of this country, and people have written about this, is kind of proceeding apace. And it doesn't mean that we're going to totally collapse, but it means that we're going to be a lot less than we could be as a country.
Yeah, it does seem that everything is accelerating to just not just the hollowing out of the middle class, but like you said, essentially, it is the biggest part of Brazilification. It's this kind of stratospheric rupture between what the underclass is and what the overclass is, and
Yeah,
constant criminal battles between these factions, and
right.
yeah,
And by the
and
way, I mean, Brazil has gotten a lot worse. My wife's parents grew up in Brazil. They were American expats there for a while, and uh, the sort of Rio de Janeiro that they describe, living in sort of the 1950s, early 1960s, or her grandparents who kind of come there, was a much more hospitable and happy place than I think the country is today. So you can degenerate from where they were to where they are today, and again, it's a very worrisome trend here in the United States.
yeah, it does seem like that's the trend. I mean, that's essentially what kind of scared me away from living in London for the longest time. It just got really scary, and it became like, the lying eyes school of empirical research was giving me more and more data that things were really heating up, and in the media you can really tell. I mean, it's just whatever stories you want to hear, but just
Right.
around my house, people were getting stabbed, like, two kids, one killed the other kid, like, 13, 14-year olds, it's just the police was scanning the park next to my house for hidden knives because apparently the kids, in the gangs like to hide knives under rocks and stuff, and they have their
Yeah.
stashes, and they kept pulling out knives from rocks just like 3 meters next to my door, and I was like, okay, this this is a bit much. And also there people would say it like London, big metropolis, always attracted a lot of people from around the world. It never used to be like this. Like
Yeah.
this scale of criminality is just unheard of.
Well, and of course, the
um
left in London talks about knife control, right? I mean, they do. It's literally
yeah,
like it's the same. It's almost like a parody if you're familiar with the U.S. arguments on gun control. It's like the same thing except knives. I'm like, maybe there's like an underlying third variable that you're missing here because
a
Montana,
third
where we
rail
live, we're
that you're
actually the most
missing here.
armed state in the country. I mean, everybody here has guns. And it's not that we have no crime, but we have very, very little random crime. I mean, I can walk certainly around anywhere in my city pretty much at any time without any worry about that, despite the fact that like I expect that I know both I and certainly all my neighbors are heavily armed, right? So it's there's another variable or variables at work there, and maybe we should explore what's going on there rather than blaming guns and knives.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's the same here in my little town in Romania. I mean, there's virtually no criminality, no violent crime. Like, there's no breakings in the. There's corruption. There's kind of a bit of a mafia state, as you can imagine. You need to, yeah, negotiate your way through life through a lot of relationships. It's not as direct as in Anglo land, but we make it work. Yeah, it's another thing I wanted to ask you about is kind of you mentioned your article, like the Tocqueville, writing about the U.S. and I think he does not mention immigration at any point. I thought that was a really
Yeah,
interesting perspective.
doesn't mention immigration, doesn't mention immigrants, and there's a couple reasons why. And it's not that, of course, he didn't wasn't aware that there weren't immigrants I think he wrote it in the 1830s America, but we were really before. And so at this point, there's 200 plus years of European settlement in America. I mean, if you want to go back to St. Augustine, it's really like 250 years at this point. But um, more time between we are closer to de Tocqueville than de Tocqueville was to the initial settlement by Europeans of the United States. So sort of start there. But the really first significant immigration of non-British people to the United States happened in the wake of the failed revolutions of 1848 in Europe. That's actually when some of my family began showing up from Central Europe. Various folks who were on the wrong side of those things began coming in. Now, of course, it wasn't that there weren't any immigrants from those places beforehand, but as best we can tell, America at the time of the revolution was about 85% British. If not higher. And just a few scattered people from some of these other places. I think 85% British, maybe 9% Dutch. You'd had the original settlement in New Amsterdam, and then some French, some Swiss. Our county, my county, Gallatin County, is actually named after Albert Gallatin, who was a Swiss guy who was Jefferson's Secretary of State when the Lewis and Clark expedition came out here. So it's not that we didn't have immigrants or immigration, but it was a much more um, it was essentially a British outpost here, that was kind of creating its own political independence. And it was so immigration just wasn't so relevant to de Tocqueville when he was thinking about democracy in America. And it was only after that that we kind of moved into a more mixed society, and then ultimately for a little while an immigration. A more heavy immigration society before we shut the door for 40 years, starting in the 1920s.
Yeah, I think one aspect of kind of having a core culture and having essentially, like you said, 85% British, 90% British, um, is that it benefits immigrants as well. Like, people see culture as, oh, we eat at a restaurant, there is food, a culture is a coordination mechanism about how I stand in relationship to you. You know, we need to know what the rules are so that we can cooperate, we can do business, we can speak the same language, we can refer to the same references, and this benefits immigrants as well because you know you come in, you plug in, you learn the culture, and then you can plug into everyone else who
Right.
shares that culture. You essentially, by having multiculturalism, you deprive that person of all of those opportunities and you essentially ghettoize them because that's what happens. They go into these cities, they go into Romania town, only speak Romanian, only interact with Romania, only do Romanian businesses. Surprise, it looks like Romania.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
just like Bangladesh town looks exactly like, you know, Bangladesh.
Yeah. And I, it's interesting because I grew up in North Carolina in a town where everybody was basically white or African American. Um, and those cultures were had some overlap and obviously also some significant differences, but there was really nobody else at the time. It's no longer true. Um, and I now kind of live in a place that's pretty monoculturally white, which is obviously very unusual in the United States these days. Um, but for folks who were not part of one of those majority cultures at the time, they were actually very strongly accepted, certainly where I grew up, and they assimilated, which is now a dirty word, of course, but was actually really good into those cultures. Some of the, I knew Chinese immigrant kids who became more Southern than Southern because they weren't, there wasn't like the Chinese immigrant enclave. There was no Chinatown where I grew up, right? So like you show up here, you're from a different culture, and you figure out and navigate that culture and become part of that culture. And the good thing about a kind of contained level of immigration is that you can do that. You can welcome that level of diversity when it's controlled, and it contributes some new things to your culture, and your culture changes to some manageable degree because of that, and you keep the kind of overall cultural unity that you're, I think, kind of getting at. To me, this is just a much more healthy way to run a country, and a much more serious way to run a country, and it was better for the people who grew up in it. And in some ways, I was even a foreigner to the kind of core culture. My family was not a an old Southern family, but you figure it out. You figure it out, and then over time you adapt, and um, you learn, and you become accepted, and that to me is just the way a healthy society should work.
Yeah, and I think there's also kind of the aspect, you know, what it looks like coming from one of the cultures that tends to you know, essentially send people abroad, you know, like myself, you know, I go abroad and there's this idea of brain drain, and it is quite hard for the I know, like, from the perspective of the US, you know, who cares? You know, if you can, you know, bring in people who make money, you know, it's great. The U.S. has won at the contest of nations. It's the greatest place. Everyone wants to go there. But for the countries that these people are leaving from, it's not great. But there is one way in which immigration really does benefit these countries, and a lot of people are doing this right now. They go abroad, kind of like myself. They essentially do almost an apprenticeship in what it is to do business. You know, learn how to cook in like an industrial kitchen. We now have like a really good Thai restaurant here done by Romanian guys who went to work in a Thai restaurant in the UK, and they learned from the people there and they brought it back, and it's really decent. So it's stuff like that. I think this is quite, you know, enriching, but essentially it means that the people come back and they remain back.
Yeah. No, and that's great, right? When people do come back and bring with them some of those skills and experiences, and again, I don't think that a culture should be hermetically sealed. I mean, I'm a reactionary, but I'm not that reactionary. Okay. I mean, there is going to be some flow in between cultures, particularly with the internet. It's almost inevitable, but um uh, again, it's just a question of what are the limits and in whose interests are we governing. And I think that's what uh, gets lost. Um, and if folks want to come here and learn the American way and bring some parts of that work back to where they're from, I think that's great. If they are super, super awesomely talented and they want to stay, that's also great. But beyond that, I question whether it really serves the national interest. I don't even think it's designed to serve the national interest. It's like designed to like assuage the white guilt of suburban cat moms in America. That's like who the target core group of our immigration policy, I feel like, is today. Um,
Yeah.
so
You
it's
can't
not serious.
really. Yeah, I just think that you can't really have an immigration policy if you don't believe that there is something to the American way,
Yeah,
and that the American way is more than, a nation of immigrants. Because if you think that's, we're, a propositional nation, the proposition is we're a nation of immigrants, essentially there's not really anything to it. It's just like, oh, we're nothing. We're just the empty shell that we will greet you into. So
right.
yeah, there has to be a primary culture, a vivid, interesting, with a bit of kind of self love there.
Yeah,
You need to have a core constituency of people who really, and that's essentially what attracted people to America in the first place. If this devitalized, self hating, archophobic, call it whatever, version of Europe and America, it's running on fumes. This is not what people are going to. And also, a lot of people that I know from here who are immigrating to places like the UK, they're explicitly going for the money. I still kind of went because I was interested in mingling with whatever type of elite people that I thought that could teach me something from the Anglosphere. I like the culture. I read the books, all that type of stuff. But most people just realize that okay, these places are rich. What else is there to
right.
know about them? They're rich and we can go and get more money there. And
Yeah.
that's what they're sending out. It's gonna be done very soon. Like this can continue.
Yeah, no, and it can. And of course, we don't have the cultural self confidence in America to declare that we do offer something more than that. Now, when I say we, I really should exclude folks on the right. I mean, I think there are a lot of folks on the right who have a very distinctive and strong sense of America as a culture and a place and things that we have to offer, but we're sort of marginalized from um, the sort of broader discussion that one is allowed to have. So then that becomes a problem. But things that can't go on forever won't. And this is, as you just alluded to. I mean, it's not sustainable. So it's going to blow up. And the question is, in what direction is it going to blow up, and what are going to be the consequences of that? And one of the things that I'm very happy about being in Montana is kind of being there are downsides to being far away from the centers of power, but there are also good things. I kind of I studied a lot of Chinese history at Yale, and one of the things that you kind of do as you read Chinese history is uh, the the rulers lose the mandate of heaven and they're overthrown by somebody. But especially in the earlier years of China, when it was a less unified country, there's always for 150 years thereafter, there's kind of like rebels in the countryside who are not, giving allegiance to the new regime. And I sort of view my life in Montana as a little bit like that. I mean, we're sort of out here as the rebels in the countryside who have not acceded to the new regime, and perhaps we will be the folks who eventually, in a purely metaphorical sense, of course, march on the Beijing of our current times and kind of overthrow the Leviathan. Um, uh, but it's just the current situation is just not sustainable.
Yeah, and you're the revolutionary ferment,
Yeah,
like the
that's what
Unabomber.
we can. Inshallah, inshallah.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, like I said, that's the place. That's the place to be if you if you want to have some, if you want to write some manifestos or anything. I'm sure there's definitely a
Yeah,
market for it.
well, as we
Um,
were talking before we got on, the Unabomber is Montana's most famous intellectual, probably. So we do have it. I'm not endorsing his ideas, by the way, but we do get some eccentrics up here with all the wide open space. And as one of my friends here said to me, explaining why they'd taken a long time to contact me over after being virtually introduced. He said, "Well, but if we'd wanted to meet other people, we wouldn't have moved to Montana." So that's there is some element of that out here in the hinterland.
that sounds calming and beautiful, very
It is.
zen. I do envy you.
I'm looking out at
Um,
the mountains as we speak. So
hmm, that's wonderful. It is time. It is time, Jeremy. I will ask you the question of the show. Are you ready? What's your subversive intellectual? Who should we be reading? Who's ignored?
okay, well, I've got a few, and I am prepared for this question as a
Good.
loyal subversive podcast listener. I'll give a few in sort of different frames of subversiveness and obscurity. So the first one I'll give is just a really, really obscure one because he's sort of on the theme of what we've talked about today. A guy named Paul Lake, who just died this year, who I never met, who was the poetry editor at First Things. I think that was the closest he got to being part of the conservative movement in any way. But he was a gifted poet and intellectual of various sorts who wrote for a variety of publications, not exclusively affiliated with the conservative movement. But he wrote an absolutely brilliant book called Cry Wolf that nobody has read, about American immigration. And it's essentially a 1984 style uh, fable that takes place, or not 1984, really Animal Farm. It's really Animal Farm. It literally takes place on a farm of different animals, and it is the most brilliant um, parable of immigration and the dangers of multiculturalism. It's done exquisitely well. But because it was ideologically verboten, and because I think Mr. Lake was not a self-promoter to say the least, both it and he have been totally forgotten. But it is worth checking out. It's a really brilliant piece of work. So that one I'll recommend. Another one I would recommend that I believe Pedro Gonzalez mentioned when he was on your podcast would be Sam Francis, who I think kind of understood Leviathan. He was again a really distant intellectual. I mean, he had some racial enthusiasms that I don't share, although I think in some ways that he did have some insights even on race relations because of his kind of old South leanings. But I think sort of more importantly, he had a an incredible understanding of the managerial state, and the way that it was used to kind of oppress Americans. And you can read stuff from Francis, um, who died, I don't know, 20 plus years ago or close to 20 years ago, I think now, um, that just feels like it was written now in terms of all the fecklessness of the Republican Party. He was a big student of James Burnham and wrote several books on Burnham. Um, and he just really had a very sophisticated understanding of what was to come. And even David Brooks, who is the epitome of a kind of squishy fake conservative intellectual, wrote a piece a few years ago in the New York Times who's like, well, yeah, I mean, Sam Francis had some bad views on race issues, but I have to acknowledge that he was really prescient in terms of seeing kind of where everything was going in terms of the managerial state, and kind of being a Trumpist before Trump. Um, I'd particularly recommend "Beautiful Losers: Essays on the Failure of American Conservatism." Um, I don't think it's in print. You can find copies. Of course, this is unofficial because I would never encourage anyone to violate copyright, but I believe you can, with a little digging, find some free copies of it online, particularly the title essay, which was written for Chronicles magazine in 1993, is just, I mean, it's just brilliant. Again, like it's a sort of thing. It almost like you almost miss the brilliance because it's like seeing um, a film in which some great new technical breakthrough was done 40 years later, and you're like, well, yeah, now everybody does CGI, everybody does this. But no, he like was talking about these sorts of things, and the failures of the GOP, 40 years ago, in a way that just totally relevant today. So I think he's really brilliant. Another guy who's kind of much closer to the mainstream, but was certainly subversive and was hated for it, is a V.S. Naipaul, who, in a brief moment of non-political correctness after September 11th, was actually awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was an Indo-Trinidadian uh, writer who lived most of his adult life subsequently in England. Um, just a brilliant writer. And I think he really understood the colonial encounter and um, the frictions between races and cultures in just an incredibly profound way. And he was a wonderful writer. And in fact, I read a long piece for Claremont once when after he died a few years ago, just sort of an appreciation of Naipaul's work, in which I mentioned that there was a guy who a friend of mine and we were sort of mutual friends with this guy, a fairly prominent guy. So I'm not going to mention who he is, but he said, I bet you and this guy do not agree on a single thing. Um, and when Naipaul died, this guy wrote a big appreciation of Naipaul, the person who I didn't agree with about anything. And I think that really just speaks to how much Naipaul's understanding of the human condition really transcended ideology. I particularly recommend his trilogy on India, which he kind of was able to do from a perspective of somebody of Indian origin, but who was not Indian, and so he sort of has a certain distance. His book, A Bend in the River, about the post-colonial Congo, which is, I think, one of the most savage books on post-colonialism ever written. Um, the Enigma of Arrival, A House for Mr. Biswas, which was kind of an autobiographical book of him growing up in sort of straitened circumstances in Trinidad. Just a wonderful writer. I mean, a very unpleasant person, by the way. I feel that probably should be added, as many of these guys probably were in their own lives. So a very difficult person, but a guy with wonderful insight, um, and maybe not entirely subversive because uh, he was some of the stuff he wrote scandalized people, so he wasn't fully accepted, but he was certainly accepted. But he's a guy who I find, because he wasn't, and he was certainly a man of the right, but because he didn't engage in politics or polemical writing in that way, is not as appreciated by folks on the right and not as read by folks on the right as he really should be. He's a really wonderful writer, and would highly recommend him to anybody.
Oh, wonderful. That's great recommendations. I also kind of want to note that indeed the kind of the curmudgeonly writer, be he even like in the 80s, there's this whole generation of super, assholey writers that are like famously douchey. Just I think what was it like Kingsley Amis was a big douche, and even just people who write just fiction. I think the fact that now those have been replaced by just I don't know women who write like confessional essays at 45 about what they felt like when they first went to like, Equinox Gym or something like that is
Yeah,
is a huge tragedy. Like,
yeah,
yeah, so
yeah.
you kind of have to be a bit of a strange outcast, kind of incelly old dude to
Right.
produce to plumb the depths of human
We all
weirdness.
eat, pray, and love now, and that's it. That's all we're allowed
Exactly.
to do. Except we're not really allowed to pray unless it's to like some non-Christian, non-Western
Pray
god.
to non-Christian stuff. Yeah, don't
Yeah, and,
you
and
be
love is
delving
only
into
like in some non-binary way. So maybe we're just allowed to eat. I don't know. Maybe that's where
yeah, we're definitely encouraged to eat.
where
That's for
where
sure.
we've gotten to in society. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. This was just yeah, lovely, and it was a long time coming, and I'm very happy that you come on.
Delighted to come on. If anybody would like to follow me or any of the stuff I do, best place is my Twitter account, which is at Jeremy Carl 4. Uh, Not a very creative, cute anon type sign off, but that's where
The
you can
fourth Jeremy call is the best one.
you can find my very public stuff, and I put most of my writing up there. Or you can go to my website jeremycarl.com, and I've got links to most of it there. But pleasure talking, Alex. We'll look forward to seeing you out in Florida at various places at NatCon, and we'll
Oh man.
continue the conversation.
yeah, I'm excited as well. Yeah, very looking forward to see you.